allow things to come in. And I think that we all are pretty good listeners, but when we stop to really think about it, there are a lot of places that we may not be as successful as we think we are. And listening is probably one of the most important aspects of being successful as a business person, as well as just another human being who's listening. If you do coaching, listening is really critical. It's critical in your household with the people you live with. It's critical all the way through everything. And it pains me that we have speech classes, but we don't have listening classes. We aren't taught how to listen in school. So I've always had a desire to learn more about listening, and probably you will eventually do a course on it. So let me go ahead and start. I've got some notes here I'm going to work from. So if you see me look down, it's just to reference those notes. I want to start with a quote. This is by a fellow by the name of Robert McCloskey, and he was a diplomat. And this is a quote from him. "I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." I'll come back to that again and read it later, because it becomes even more relevant when we look at these different aspects of listening. So why do people have a hard time listening? Well, there are a number of different barriers to listening. And one of them is that we're too busy to listen. We have so much going on in our own lives. Even during COVID-19, when things have slowed down, we have so many things we have to get to that we hurry through the listening process. And we may hear somebody, but we don't really listen to them. The second barrier is that we may want to avoid deep conversations. One of the things we say to each other is, "How are you?" But do we really want to listen to what the person says about how they are? It can be uncomfortable because it may be too much information for you. "How are you?" is this little courtesy that we have when we talk to each other. But we can create really deep connections if we actually listen and tell people how we are and listen to what they say in terms of that. So there's a difficulty in handling things that are extremely personal for us. We don't do it. We do it oftentimes with people that we're really close to, but there's almost a taboo about doing it, especially in business, because it's just, there's that quote, "It's just business." It's never just business. So some more barriers are that a lot of times when we're listening to somebody, we're on the phone and we're doing other things like driving. And when you're driving, you really don't have enough attention towards what's coming in through your headset or what's coming over the speaker in terms of what the other person is saying. And I'll get into some of what's involved in actually listening. And it's not a passive activity, but a lot of us treat it as if it is one. The other thing that's a barrier is that oftentimes, rather than listening, we're spending time trying to figure out what we're going to say next. We're hearing part of what somebody says, and then we need to have our response immediately ready. We feel like there's an immediacy in the way that we have to communicate. And that a lot of times prevents us from really hearing what the other person's saying. We also may also feel that we miss the opportunity to put forward our ideas or our brand or our products. And if we stop and listen too long to what somebody else says, we may not get a chance to actually say what we think is so important to say. The difficulty with that is when we talk, we're not learning, we're talking about things we already know. The only way we really can learn is to listen to people who are saying something different than what we're saying. Here are 4 basic bad habits of listening. 1 is interrupting. And that's become a little bit of a challenge, especially on Zoom. When you're on Zoom and nobody's really mediating the meeting, people tend to talk over each other. And usually they'll back off, but there is a tendency to speak over each other. So it's very important that you stay away from that bad habit of interrupting. Second bad habit is to come back with vague responses. A vague response is an indication that you really didn't hear what the person said, and you heard part of it. And so what you're doing is just coming back with a quick kind of saying, yeah, I hear you, even though you don't. Third thing is, and I find myself doing this sometimes in Zoom, is that we'll look down at our phone. We'll look away. We'll look, if we're having a conversation with somebody one-on-one, you may find that the person that you're talking with all of a sudden is looking over your shoulder at somebody else or something else that's going on. So that's another bad habit. They may also, or they may look at their watch as well as their phone. And finally, fidgeting. Have you ever had a situation where you're talking to somebody and they're so busy fidgeting with something that you don't think that there's any chance that they're actually listening to you? So another thing to avoid in terms of that's a barrier is if we're listening with an expectation of getting a certain result. And as business people, a lot of us end up being guilty of this. The result being, hey, I want to sell my product. Hey, I want to get this person to know what I'm doing. If we listen that way to make a sale, for instance, people know. People can pick that up. There are a lot of things that we pick up subconsciously when we're in the process of listening. And we may listen selectively for a couple of different reasons. The first one is called confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. How many of you are familiar with that term? Okay, a few of you, okay. Confirmation bias is interpreting whatever you hear that's new in terms of what you already know. And it's easy to do because we want to contextualize everything. But one of the difficulties with confirmation bias is that we don't hear what's new. We just hear what's similar. The second selectivity problem is the expectancy bias. And that has to do with looking at what supports our viewpoint. And I'm going to talk towards the end of this a lot about that because I think that's probably the biggest difficulty right now, is the ability to hear something that's of a different opinion than yours is. We've gotten really, really, really bad and very polarized about that today, mm-hmm. especially through social media. Mm-hmm. One of the things we have to realize is, and this can be a barrier as well, is that we can't really understand or speak for anybody else because we don't know the whole context of where they're speaking from. And that can really be a difficult thing. As well as, and this kind of goes into that expectancy bias, we can't judge people by one thing about them. Right. Somebody's political leanings do not define who that person is. Right. It's really easy for us to just say, well, if somebody's this way, then I'm not going to listen to what they have to say. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more to people for most people, than their political leanings or the religious or their philosophical. So, all right, now we have another, thinking about it from that point of view of those barriers, let me read you that quote again. I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure that you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. You see how all these barriers can create that misunderstanding. All right, so what happens to people when we don't listen to people? You've heard of being lonely in a crowd. This is a common situation. You may have a lot of people around you, but none of them really listen to you. They all either think they already know what you're going to say, or they don't have time. And so a lot of us feel this loneliness of not really being able to communicate, not really being heard by somebody else. And again, with all the barriers we just talked about, you can see why that could happen. They find that a lot of people who commit suicide and a lot of people who go on these crazy rampages have a background of loneliness, and a lot of times this goes right back to not being heard. It's also one of the factors involved in bullying, because a bully oftentimes is developed in somebody who's not being heard. So let me describe what listening actually is. They did some scientific studies, and they did MRIs of the brains of people as they were communicating with each other. And they found out that when people had clear communication between the two or amongst people, that there was a syncing of the brain waves. So something physiologically actually happens when you're in a good conversation and you're listening and the other person's listening. It puts you, and we've all had that. Everybody here probably has somebody that whenever they talk to them, you know that they know what you're talking about. And they know that you know and vice versa. Okay? Because what happens is that you are already on that sync. Think of that good friend. As soon as you start talking, that link happens between your two brains. And all of a sudden you have this phenomenal conversation. And I always wonder, well, why doesn't that happen with everybody? And it's because the sync isn't created, because there isn't a history of listening. The ability to sync brainwaves and to listen is directly attached to the way that your parents attuned to your needs as you grew up. And this was something that I was surprised to read about. But for parents who ignored their children, there's a difficulty in connecting with other people. And we would think that that was true. The opposite is also true. Those parents that took care of everything for people, the helicopter parents, also did a great disservice to their children, because their children have trouble being attentive because their parents were always helping them to be attentive. They didn't have the experience on their own. So I was really surprised to find those things out. Another thing that's kind of interesting is who we listen to shapes how we think and how we behave. Who are the top 4 or 5 people that you communicate with? Think about how they have an impact on who you are and how you go about your daily life. So, what is good listening? How do you do this thing? Good listening is, good listening requires curiosity. You have to be curious about the person you're talking to. And you also have to try and be empathetic. You have to try and figure out what's going on in that person's head, even though we can never really know. When we're listening, though, we should listen to try and figure out, why are they saying what they're saying? What brought them to those conclusions? What makes them say the things that they say? And so you see, it's not passive. The brain's extremely active while all this is going on, if you're doing good listening. Now, the attitude we take into listening is also going to influence how we listen. If we grew up, and I'm going to go back to the parental thing there, or if we're living through our lives and we expect criticism, then we're going to be resistant to the listening that we do, because we're expecting whatever we hear to be critical of what how we're doing things and what we're doing. So it's really important that we think about what our expectations are in a conversation before we get into that conversation. And we've got to, in some cases, fight against our natural tendencies to expect that other people either are going to be critical or that other people are going to not think that we're very smart, or there are a number of different kinds of tapes that we play in our heads. And we've got to get past those tapes in order to be able to be good listeners. Hearing is passive. You hear first, but then you have to listen, and that's where the active is. You need to process the information that's coming in and find meaning. You have to develop empathy. You have to have insight and get some knowledge about the person you're working with. So that's kind of how listening works. Now, here's another thing that makes listening a challenge, and that's what I call the gap. We can speak at people speak at between 120 and 150 words a minute. Okay? How fast do we think? Much faster than that. So while you're listening, your brain's off doing 10 or 12 other different things. And that's what makes it so difficult to stay on track. We think about other things, we get sidetracked. And when we get sidetracked and we're listening and we don't hear what's being said, then we fill in the blanks. And of course, we're going to fill in blanks with all the things that we were talking about, what you have, your expectations in going into the conversation, what you think about the person you're talking to. And you're not necessarily going to hear what they're saying. You're going to hear what you think they're saying because you're busy thinking rather than listening. Okay? So listening seems like such a simple thing, but it's not. There are so many different components that are going on. And one of the things that another study found is the smarter people are, the harder it is for them to listen, because the smarter they are, the more things are going on in their brain while they're in the process of listening. So I would have thought the opposite, but that's not true. So this gap between what's said and how you listen to it and process it is an opportunity to figure out what's actually being said. There's something that they teach actors called subtext. I'm sure most of you are familiar with subtext. Subtext is not what the actors say to each other or what we say to each other. It's what's actually going on in our heads while we're saying that. I think it was in Annie Hall, they were writing the subtext underneath in a scene. They were writing the subtext underneath the scene. The characters were saying one thing, the subtext was something else. And there's oftentimes that discrepancy between what's being said and what's actually being thought. So using that, knowing that that gap is there between how quickly we can speak and how distracted we can be by our minds can help us. So what do? Well, you do the same thing you do in meditation. In meditation, you try to get quiet and your mind quiets down, and all of a sudden, oh, I gotta get groceries. And then if you're doing good meditation, you say, okay, I realize, I see that, I'm coming back. Enough of that. It's like an elephant that's tethered. It can go so far and then it feels the tether and then it comes back. So in meditation, we always come back to that center. That's a very good way to work with hearing things, with listening to things, is to deal with with being able to acknowledge those distractions and then come back and listen. As soon as you realize that you're not listening, start listening again. Again, as I said before, one of the big difficulties is that during that gap, many of us are trying to figure out what we're going to say next. We feel like we have to respond to everything that everybody says to us. And so we're all of a sudden creating that next response that we have. What if you didn't worry about what you were going to say next? You listened, you paused to interpret it, and then you responded. I think one of the things that would happen is the person that you were speaking with would appreciate that, because they would feel as though they were being listened to, and that you were more interested in listening to them than coming up with the next thing that you're going to say. So that short pause might be useful in terms of your communication. And what happens if you come back and because you're listening and you say something that's a mistake, you can always go clean that up in the later. We can always do that. We can always go fix that. I'm going to talk a little bit about tactics, and then I'm going to get into listening to opposite views. How much time do I have left?
You've got about 10 more minutes.
10 minutes, okay. I'm going to go through the tactics pretty quickly because I really want to get into this listening to opposite views. I think that's, in today's world, probably one of the most important things. Okay, we all are aware we need to listen, and we need to listen, and we need to be listened to. When you listen for commonalities in order to build rapport. What do you have in common with somebody? And you want to share that. You want to, however, you want to have that pause in there so that the person doesn't think you're just replying with, oh yeah, I've done that too, or I've done that better, or whatever it is. We were having a conversation before everything started, and Kimball was talking to Laura, and Laura was saying she was from Boston, and Kimball was able to relate some things about Boston so that the rapport already was building between the two of them. That's a really good tactic in order to be able to start a really good listening session. We need to realize that listening is a skill, and one that most of us haven't really had courses in. And so the only way that you get better at listening is listening. So if you become aware that you need to be reflective about what you're doing in the listening process, you'll become a better listener. The other thing that's really interesting about listening is that, and this is kind of a tactic, the better you listen, the more you actually learn about yourself as well as the other person. If you're listening and you feel emotions coming up about something, that tells you something about yourself. If you listen and somebody hits a hot button, it's useful to know what that hot button is so that you don't have to immediately react to it this time or in the future. So there are a lot of things we can learn about ourselves by listening. The other thing is that when we listen to somebody, usually people are telling a story. A lot of times when we're communicating, the details of the story are not as important as what the story means to the person who's telling it. A lot of times we get caught in the details, but you're not going to get a test on the details. The test that you're going to get is whether you got the meaning of it and why it was important to them. So one of the other things to do is, before you get into that conversation, check your mindset, check your point of view. Realize where you're coming from when you're doing this. Okay. Now, with all that as background, I want to go into this next piece of listening to opposing views, because I think it's very important. I worked for a company called ABB years ago. And when I was there, one of the things that I was in the research center, one of the things they asked us to do is go get complaints from your customers. This is one of the things we're going to evaluate you on. And we looked at each other and said, are they crazy? Why would you want to bring up all the negative things for your customers for them to say about you? And I mean, it took us a month to really come to understand it, but as we did that, and those things were recorded, we saw where we needed to improve. We saw what we were doing wrong. We saw the places we could begin to work on being better, providing better service to our customers. But it was so counterintuitive at first that we really thought that our leaders had lost their minds. All right. So when we listen, as I said before, we listen to, in a lot of cases, to support our own viewpoint. And when we're listening to support our own viewpoint, whether it's to somebody on a platform, on a social media platform, whether it's someplace where we pick out the people that we already know and we already know what they think, in any of those situations, it feels good to have our own viewpoint supported. When we come across somebody who has a different viewpoint, we jump in and we disagree. We need to let them know we're not of the same mind that they are. And oftentimes we don't even hear all of what they're saying. So we don't understand, we don't know that maybe they're at the same place, but they're using different words to get there. There is a feeling of being unsafe when your position is challenged. Again, they did things with an MRI with people, and they found out that the amygdala center, which is this fight-flight center, is highly aroused when there is a challenge to your viewpoint or your values. And what happens when you're in the fight or flight or freeze mode? You can't listen. You're too self-oriented to be able to hear what's going on with other people. So it becomes really important that we understand that when we're challenged, that we feel unsafe in a lot of cases. And just the realization of that may be the chance that we get to step back from that and say, no, you're safe. You're all the way across the country from this person. You're all the way across the room from this person. Or you're 5 feet from this person. They can't hurt you. Because fight and flight was originally set up in human beings as a response when you saw a bear or a snake or something else to save your life. However, as we become more sophisticated, fight and flight kind of works on in a more sociability pattern. In other words, we are threatened when we feel like we're going to be ostracized from a group, when we feel like people are going to ignore us, when we feel like we're going to be an outsider. Those are the things that elicit that same response in the modern day. So when we encounter somebody that challenges our position, we can feel it. You usually can feel it in the pit of your stomach. I can think of a lot of conversations I've had in which I can feel that I'm going to get aggressive because I feel like I'm being attacked. And I don't even end up listening to the person all the way through.
Drew?
Yes.
Drew, I know I'm interrupting, so we can do this afterwards, but I had an insight about something you just said that I wanted to share with you.
Sure.
And it has to do with collecting or gathering that interim agreement. You mentioned it at the beginning. You didn't call it interim agreement, but it's the process of feeling insecure, if you will, and getting a like opinion to make yourself feel better. Okay, so I work with women in particular, and this is the basis of gossip. Because what happens is there's a fear to take the issue to the person who could actually do something about it, because they don't have the chutzpah or whatever it takes to go directly to the source. So what they do is, and adults do this all the time, instead of completing it, solving the issue, because of the level of fear, they run around to their buddies, they relay the story, and they gather agreement. Unfortunately, when they do this, they are very free with who the story is about, right? And so this whole behavior causes a lot of consternation among women and in women's groups. So we have to be courageous or confident enough that when something happens that's upsetting, that rather than running around getting everybody to say, oh, you're really great and they did it wrong, but actually to go to the source and solve it there. And that's what I got from what you just shared.
And that's a fear response that creates that situation, a fear of confrontation, of having to deal with that for those exact reasons that we were talking about, of feeling the possibility of ostracized, etc.
Thank you.
Okay. And now, this is all exacerbated by the web. This is all made much worse by all this stuff on Facebook and Twitter and etc. These have become platforms in which there's no good housekeeping seal of approval on anything that's said or written. It's just opinion. And in a lot of cases, it's unfounded. And so that becomes really difficult. And what happens is that the social media is set up so that it will feed whatever you put out there. So if you like something, you get more of it. So what happens is we get supported in exactly the way that Leslie was talking about in social media by more posts that kind of say, yeah, that's fine, patting us on the back saying, you got it, that's exactly right. And so the more of that we read, the less we're able to be open to anything outside of that. And that's one of the real dangers to me in spending a lot of time in social media. So that's one of the things one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to understand listening to opposing views. Let's see.
I apologize if I took you off your game.
No, that's okay. I'm getting back into it. Okay.
Thank you.
In 2016, up to 1/3 of families and friends have stopped talking to each other because of political disagreements. I don't know about you, but I think in my family, there are schisms because of politics. And I think it's probably true in most families. And some of those people are still not talking to each other. So that's one of the really, really negative things with this, since we've pushed this dichotomy between perspectives to such a strong degree. We had, and I'm gonna share this. We have Zoom sessions every week with my family, and when it's my sisters and myself, it's usually fairly civil, partly because we're mostly in agreement. But then when we widen the number of people that are coming in, we've gotten into the point where we've had some very nasty discussions. They're not discussions because nobody's listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had people that won't get back into the Zoom meetings because of this. So I don't know if any of you have experienced that at all, but I mean, it's now happening on the Zoom platform as well as live. So the idea is when you're listening and you hear something that opposes your viewpoint and your values, to be calm, to be open, and again, to be curious. I talked about the fact that you have to be curious to really listen. So perk up your curiosity when you're in the process. The truth of the matter is that we only become secure in our convictions when they're challenged. If they're not challenged, the first time the challenge comes, we can't deal with it. But we can build up a certain immunity to that challenging by involving ourselves in discussions that deal with that challenge. So even though it may not, and it's not, it may not, and for me, it's not comfortable to do that. I find that if I'm going to be a good listener, I've got to hear the other side. And I have to be able to hear it, and I have to listen to it before I make a judgment about it. And I don't have to share my judgment about it. Mm-hmm. One of the mistakes that I think a lot of people have is that if you're listening to somebody that has the opposite viewpoint than you have, then you may feel like, oh, well, I might have to change my mind. No, you don't necessarily have to change your mind. You don't have to agree with them, but it really helps to listen to them. So there's a growth that comes out of allowing yourself to be challenged. And someone that you listen to is going to be more willing to listen to you. Mm-hmm. Which probably goes without saying, but we forget it. The truth of the matter is, let me ask you this. Here's probably the ultimate way to be a good listener in terms of somebody with an opposite view. Can you listen for evidence that you might be wrong? That's a big jump. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit it is for me too.
Well, Drew, what if you're not wrong? Okay, so
well,
what if everybody is right from their perspective, and then when we listen to somebody else, we can opt to pluck that which resonates with us and add it to our own cache. That's kind
absolutely.
of that's how I look at it.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the thing is that you don't have to be wrong for them to be right, as you said, Leslie. That's really an important thing to understand when you're listening. And if we listen like that, we can make the whole culture safer. We can make it less toxic. It's when we stop talking to each other that we create the danger in this culture. Yes. Now, the other thing that this takes, and I said something about, can you listen for evidence that you might not be right, the only person that's right. I'll change it to say that, or not entirely right. If you do that, you have to be able to live in a world of uncertainty. And we've had a great opportunity over the last 4 months to live in a world that's uncertain. But it also makes it harder because there's so much uncertainty around us to be able to allow uncertainty into our own lives. So I'm going to just finish by saying, please, the next time you're listening to somebody, spend a few extra seconds between the responses just to interpret what they say and to think about what you're going to say before you respond. And if any of you do that, everything that I've done today is worth its weight in gold. Thank you so much, Kimball.
Thank
Awesome. I
That
have
was
another question.
awesome.
Oh, so
That's-
I have another question. So you didn't mention coaching. And my experience of being trained as a coach is that listening is a big part of it, right? And you didn't mention that. So what is your experience, Drew, with that and working with coaches as an example, even if you haven't taken a bona fide class, I know that you coach writers. So how would you include coaching as part of listening, or would you?
Oh, well, I would say you can't coach without listening. Because the essence of coaching is not to give somebody the answer, but to help them arrive at the answer. And in order to do that, you really have to hear what they're saying. And in a lot of cases, they have to hear what they're saying. A really good coach will allow somebody to come to the conclusions that they need to come to. I do astrological counseling, okay? And I have people that say to me, well, what should I do? And I say, well, here are the factors. What do you think you ought to do?
So you're
Which of these
asking
factors?
questions. So it's through this objective listening where you see it, it's not emotional. So therefore you already see a potential answer and you ask a question. It's kind of a leading question based on your intuition, isn't it? And Kimball, I know she's listening into this too. You know, coaches to me are the closest that two people can ever get because there is no expectation, there is no emotion. You're really standing next to the person, being their proponent 100%, right? Using everything you know. Anyway, I kind of digressed a little bit, but this is a very stimulating conversation for me.
Thank you. Well, my feeling about that is you don't want to ask a leading question. Because you don't want them to come to your conclusion. You need them to come to their conclusion. And in that sense, I know what you're talking about with leading question, but those are kind of the wrong words in terms of what we're talking about. You want to ask a question that's going to move them closer.
One of the things that I think is important is to ask for the person that you're listening to go deeper, to say, I want you to clarify such and such to me because I'm not sure that I understood it and I really want to understand it fully.
Yes, Laura.
Thank you. I've had one really phenomenal experience with this, and it was at our synagogue where there was a huge polarization between people who were pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. And one of the things that was done at the very onset, which I think is worth thinking about, is having everyone figure out what are your basic assumptions? What do you care about? And then when you see what the other side cares about, it makes it easier to have conversations. You don't feel that kind of fight or flight kind of response if you really do appreciate what the underlying kind of first principles are from the other side. Thank you.
You know, it was interesting. It was a great, great talk, but you know, a lot of it is what I think that goes on in politics today is that neither side can listen or hear any truth or goodness in the other side, that there is only one side. It is the left or it's the right. And you know and that there's nothing in between, and I really always believe that there's a lot more, and in graduate school I studied multiculturalism, and there's more difference within a culture than there is between it. And I kind of think that, you know, in listening to this, I think everybody needs to hear and be thinking about this, because that's really how we make our country great again, is by everybody listening to both sides and us working together. And without listening, nothing can really change.
That's beautiful. And I have to give you guys how I get over all these crazy people on the internet, because it's not me, it's them, of course. It's all of them out there. So here's the thing. A 14-year-old teenager has two mantras. I've raised two children and I got four teenage grandchildren. There are two things about them that is always true. The first thing, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, the first thing is they are absolutely correct in their point of view. I mean, they will dig their heels in. They will go to the mat that they are right about this thing. And then the other thing is that it can never happen to them. Well, the reason that they believe that so strongly is because they have a very minimal frame of reference, and based on what they've learned so far, it is true for them. They really do believe it. Now, here's the problem. In our country, we have a predominance of adolescents in adult bodies. They are not responsible. They can't see the other view. They're damn sure that they're right. And it's because emotionally, they have not developed into full adults. And there's a lot of reasons why Martin Brosman wrote a book about this, about the missing male role model in our society, how it stunts the emotionality of a man. And that's one of the reasons why divorces among long-term marriages are so prevalent, because when a man hits midlife, the spots come off and he's back there at that 16-year-old boy emotionally. He's been pretending for 25 years, and the woman wakes up next to a 16-year-old. Anyway, that probably took it too far, but how I get over all this is I realize, well, they just haven't grown up yet. They're like my adolescent, teenage grandchildren. And by understanding that they haven't gotten there yet, it allows me not to be triggered. That's what I would share about that.
That's nice.
And I think that's important. I think that's important, that we don't get triggered. That's one of the things that I tried to get across today is
yes,
don't be triggered by these things. And the analogy of a 14-year-old is a perfect way to understand that. Thank you, Leslie.
Right. Well, this has been a great, great presentation. Drew, I am so glad that you were our speaker today, and this was such an awesome topic, and I'm glad all of you joined us. I'm looking for speakers, so if you have a topic, please get with me. I would love to have you speak. And next week, we have Leslie Flowers speaking, and she is going to be teaching us about our 6 intellectual muscles. And that just sounded like such a wonderful topic to me. I can't wait. So I hope you'll come back, invite somebody else. We try to get it started at 1 and started at 12 and out at 1, but you leave with something to take with you. Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks so much, Drew. Thanks, Kimball, and everyone.